do journalists really overstate the certainty of scientific findings? Right. So before I talk about the result, I talked about the experiment setup. Because one thing that is super important is we want to analyze the findings that are talking about the same thing, right? Because even at the article level, I mean, there are so many sentences. How are we going to know whether these two things are discussing the same findings? So we designed this heuristic method that will allow us to automatically align sentences in the newspaper and in paper abstract, and that leads to a very high precision. And so finally, we have this 6,500 matched finding pairs from news articles and paper abstracts that they're talking about the same finding, which allow us to do a more fair comparison. So what's the result? So are findings in Science News more certain than those in paper abstracts? Well, actually, no. So here there are two data sets here. The blue line is the aligned data set. It's 6,000 matched finding pairs. And the orange line here is a bigger data set. It's aligned at paper level. But we're actually seeing a consistent pattern that the certainty of the findings described in the paper, in the news articles, are actually having a lower certainty comparing with the original finding in the paper abstract. So it is possible that our perception of the increased certainty in science communication are shaped by the titles, like the headlines, which are not normally written by journalists. And actually later we did another study, we see that if you're comparing with the headlines, we always see a sharp increase, that the headlines are always having an increased certainty of the original finding, but not the paper full text. So another interesting follow-up we did here is, here we're only looking into match findings in news and paper abstract. But we all know that a paper have many different sections, and in each section, the same finding can be described in many different ways by the same group of scientists, right? So previously we have aligned this with the findings in the abstract, but what if we can also do that for all the findings presented in different sections? Would the result be different? So here, remember this heuristic method, it's really a simple method. But later in the follow-up study, we build a whole new method, it's whole new NLP model that allow you to quantify the degree of information matching score of any, given any two scientific claims. So using this model, we're able to analyze not only the paper abstracts, but also the paper full text. So which finally lead to 1.1 million paired findings across news articles and paper full text. So here we're going to redo the analysis and trying to check do journalists overstate the certainty of scientific findings if we're comparing with other sections of the paper. Right, so here we not only looking into the certainty, but also looking into the exaggeration. It's another NLP model that allow you to automatically detect exaggeration in scientific claims. And we analyze the 1.1 million matched news and paper pairs. So, so just a sanity check. If we're comparing with the findings presented in news article in paper abstract, we're seeing a similar pattern, right? The certainty and also the strength of the finding, the exaggeration is going down. Journalists are not overstating. If we're comparing with the finding presented in paper abstract. And if we're comparing with other sections like introduction, results, discussion, conclusion, we're actually not seeing a very consistent pattern here. So it's more ambiguous. But when we're comparing with limitation, we see such a sharp increase of the both likelihood of exaggeration and the certainty if we're comparing with the findings described in the limitation section. Right. So it is possible that journalists may underreport the limitation of scientific findings. This is something existing study have found. But it is also possible that when the scientists are describing the same finding, even in the same paper, but in different sections, they might use different level of certainty to describe the same finding, which can be confusing for the journalist. So do journalists overstate the certainty of scientific findings? Well, based on our analysis, we found it's largely no, right? Because we actually see a decreased pattern. But it really depends on how you measure it and which specific section you are comparing with. So it really points out the complexity of making any claim about this kind of exaggeration or overstating. So this is an example how we can use NLP as a diagnosis tool to understand how certainty is being communicated in the science communication process. But how can we use NLP to help the journalist? So here I'm going to talk about another study that we're using NLP to measure the public perception of scientific information presented in the media. So we all know that like in this science communication mode, the ultimate goal is to promote public engagement with science, but it's really hard. But what if you can predict the public perception while drafting the science news stories? So here we developed this new pipeline in detecting the potential public perception of scientific information in the media. For example, this is an example that given a science news story, what if we can automatically predict all of these nuanced dimensions, right? Like newsworthiness, understandability, reading willingness, like sharing willingness, all of these nuanced public perception dimensions. So here we construct this like so far the largest science public perception data set. It covers 1,500 annotated science news stories, and the annotators coming from 2,000. It's like 2,000 representative sample participants from both the U.S. and UK, with a lot of like nuanced background information. So this is so far the largest data set, allowing you to do a lot of cool things. The way here is we build a new NLP model that allow us to automatically, given a science news story, that we can predict all of these nuanced perception dimensions. And we see that on the test set, 7 out of the 12 dimensions have a presence R above 0.5. I mean, given this such as hard test, it's a reasonable and score. I won't say it's perfect, but it's okay to use. And we also see that the model generalized pretty well on social media posts like Reddit and Twitter, and as well as paper abstracts. So what can we do about this? So I'm going to show you an example that, so we all know that people are sharing a lot of science news stories on this like R Science subreddit, but can estimated perceptions predict the engagement with science on social media? So for example, we see that regarding the predicted newsworthiness dimension, there's this like super high correlation that if a news story is, if a shared news story have a higher estimated newsworthy score, it's more likely to receive more upvotes like in our science subreddit. And it's similar to like for benefit, right? If people perceive that this science news story is going to have more benefit to them, they're more likely to engage with them. But we're seeing a different story for the expertise. Expertise is like whether this science news story requires expertise to understand. We actually see there's this negative correlation that if the public perceives that this requires like expertise to understand, they're less likely to engage with. So what if you frame the same science news story differently as a journalist, right? So here we are actually able to do a very cool natural experiment because on our science, people are actually sharing the same news article, but with very different framing of the content in the post, right? So here we're actually be able to do a natural experiment study with like 95,000 Reddit posts. I'm just going to directly show the result because we're running out of time. So the short answer is we're seeing that like when mentioning the same news article, the posts with higher estimated importance, surprisingness, and fun, they're receiving more upvotes and comments. But there's no significant differences for controversies. However, we do see that if the posts are having more perceived controversialness, it's more likely to have more comments and people are actually engaging into this kind of discussion about controversial content. So that's point out if you frame the same message, like the same science differently, you are going to have very different engagement pattern on the social media platform. And our tool can help you to predict how the public is going to react and perceive your science news story beforehand, right? So yeah, just a summary that today we're talking about NLP as not only a diagnosis tool, but also as a prediction tool that can potentially help the journalists while they're crafting science news stories. And I believe that NLP can have more power, especially combining human computation and the modern AI to help with a large-scale communication of scientific information. So these are the 3 papers I talked about in this talk, and it's all done with amazing collaborators from Michigan and University of Copenhagen. I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, I'm Sachita. As the slide says, I'm talking about de-jargonizing science for journalists with GPT-4. This is about a pilot study that we ran. I feel like Jiaxin set me up really well to talk about the potential for using NLP to help with science communication. And this is joint work with Eric Lee and Nick Leakopoulos. We're from the Computational Journalism Lab at Northwestern. What am I going to talk to you about today? I'm going to roughly talk about this prototype reading interface that we built for the preprints of peer-reviewed papers. We use GPT-4 to identify and define jargon terms based on the text of the paper, and we also piloted some kind of personalization of this identification based on the expertise of the readers. We did a pilot evaluation study with a very small number of annotators too, but we think it can be a useful proof of concept, and I'll talk about what we learned. We envision this could be useful during the news gathering process as journalists are going through tons and tons of preprints, papers, and our paper and our code are publicly available here if you'd like to test it out, build on it. Our data is available as well. All right. So today I will talk about first why we think de-jargonizing with LLMs could be an interesting use case, how we did this pilot study, what we learned from this, and then where we think this could go next. So let's dive right in. Why de-jargonize with LLMs? So part of this is that the motivation for this work came from a previous study that we did in our lab. We built an interactive interface for science news discovery, and we conducted a lot of user interviews around it. And within this interface, science reporters could rank and filter science preprints based off of their newsworthiness. We computed newsworthiness using a machine learning model. But they could also read news angles that were generated about a given abstract using GPT-3. And something we heard across the board was that the news angle was really useful, not just in brainstorming headlines or what the story could look like, but also in interpreting the abstract itself. I have some quotes here. The news angle is better than the abstract, there isn't as much jargon. And then also a few of our participants directly told us, I need a dictionary that pops up when I hover on complex words in an abstract. This is not an entirely new area of work. Interactive reading interfaces have been around for a while. They've been found to be useful as well. I have examples of 3 up here. One is Paperplane, which was developed for healthcare consumers, one for researchers, and then actually when I was doing the lit review for this project, I found one from almost 10 years ago, which was at C+J as well. The key difference is that we now have LLMs which make simple a lot of tasks, a lot of complicated NLP tasks that we use. We use named entity recognition, we match to databases and corpuses, and LLMs with their large amount of training data can help us simplify some of these tasks. So we were wondering if they might be viable and how we might test that out. So how do we do that? And so we used the data set that we used came from Archive, because there is a huge trend in the computing area, at least, to share a lot of peer-reviewed work here, just before it makes it into the journal or the conference, but after it's been accepted. And we looked at 3 subfields that are particularly newsworthy currently: AI, human-computer interaction, and then CY, that's computers and society. So talking about the social impacts of computing, AI, and so on. We looked at all the papers that were put out in March 2024. We filtered for papers that were peer-reviewed. This is something that authors will annotate themselves. They communicate that in comments. We did create a smaller sample because we had a small pool of annotators. This was a pilot study, so just in the interest of feasibility, we sampled 25%, and we ended up with 64 peer-reviewed articles from fairly newsworthy domains. What do we do with this? The first step, like I said, was to identify jargon with GPT-4, and we did want to test out a dimension of personalization. Can GPT-4 personalize the degree of jargon it identifies and the kind of jargon that it identifies based off of the expertise of the reader? Because different readers bring different levels of domain expertise to this task. And so we had a process of iterative annotation, discussion, as we refined our definition of what we constitute jargon. We also engaged in a process of refining the prompts. We found it useful to describe our experiences in very verbose manner when prompting GPT-4 to personalize. We found this to be by far the most useful technique. Since then, we've also seen some work that talks about more granular metadata. So a few short examples, writing samples for personalization. This could be useful fodder for future work. But yeah, here I have up an example of what our descriptions look like. They really are like, this is where we come from, this is what we're interested in. And following this task, we use something called retrieval augmented generation with GPT-4 to generate definitions. And this is in the interest of, having some factual grounding. And how this works is the user will input some kind of search query. In our case, that was a jargon term that they wanted the system to define. And you do the process of retrieval, wherein you find relevant snippets of text from your reference, which in this case is the scientific paper. And then you want them to contain the same key term or be very similar to it. And then you feed those relevant snippets into the language model along with the prompt. And then you would hope that the definition that is generated is synthesizing from all this context that you fed into it. That is the hope. And we also did do a baseline set of definitions wherein we just fed into the prompt the abstract of the text. We wanted to understand if it would create the model to make some kind of associations of the words and if that could yield good definitions as well. Part of this is also just the drive to be more computationally efficient. This is a bit cheaper as well. So we wanted to know if the performance is comparable, at least to the RAG case. What we found will surprise you. But yeah, and how we evaluated this, we mainly evaluated for accuracy and quality. So each annotator for each definition that they saw, evaluated whether the definition they were seeing was accurate. We searched the text of the paper to match it. But we also evaluated for quality. And we did these quality evaluations by comparing pairs of definitions. So we compared the RAG definition to our baseline definition, just in terms of how understandable they were. This kind of pairwise evaluation is common in the domain. It's found to be very useful. And so what did we learn? What did we find out? So the first thing that we learned was that GPT-4 really over-identifies jargon. Those long verbose definitions, I think a nice way I would say it is like we almost had to brag about ourselves to get it to figure out that we do know something. But what it does do well is it does maintain the differences between how annotators think about this. So on the right side, on the right side, you'll see how the annotators annotated for jargon in the papers. So the x-axis has the count of terms, the y-axis is how frequently that amount of jargon terms was annotated. So there is a difference. Annotator 1 in red is identifying more jargon terms than annotator 0. And that difference does exist. And when you look at GPT's identification, you see that the graphs kind of move to the right. GPT-4 does identify more jargon terms across the board, but it does maintain the relative differences. So that was something that we found interesting. So I just had that. And the precision and recall metrics we calculated reflected this. The median recall was fairly high, 0.68, which means if an annotator thinks something is jargon, the model is likely to recover it. But the precision was quite low, which means it's offering a lot more extra jargon terms on top as well. The second surprising finding was that RAG was not particularly impactful. In fact, the accuracy of our baseline was slightly higher, 96.6%, compared to 93.5%. The sources of the inaccuracies, because this was a small corpus, we could quickly qualitatively look through. The most popular source of inaccuracies was that GPT-4 has some reliance on latent associations, and what I mean by that is this example. So one of the abstracts mentioned this term called code contests. And this is a benchmarking data set, but both the systems that we tested kind of interpreted as a literal code contest, this despite the fact that a definition is offered in text. So these kinds of mistakes we saw, and in terms of relative quality too, we found abstract-based definitions to be slightly better. Here is just the comparison of the win percentages in our pairwise evaluations. It comes really, really close. So where do we think this goes next? And part of this is just thinking about why this happened. Why is GPT-4 without the RAG context often better than with the RAG context? We have some theories. We think this may be because of GPT-4's extensive training corpus potentially. This is a hypothesis we're testing, but there's just so much data in there that it may be able to surface relevant text, and maybe the RAG is also surfacing a lot more noisy context. So there has to be some process of meeting in the middle. With a larger data set, we could also do more qualitative evaluations. Like I said, this was a pilot study, so we think a larger data set might be handy. But we do think this has implications for newsrooms that want to use open source or smaller models for these tasks. A smaller model does not have that kind of training corpus. Maybe it can't make the same associations, but maybe it'll work better with RAG. I think these are questions worth asking. in the interest of, just computational efficiency and accuracy as well. In terms of tool design, like I said, we found some overprediction of jargon, some potential inaccuracies. What is the impact of these kinds of small, issues on the workflow of the journalist overall? Is it more effort to then check for things or, clear out the noise? Does that actually support the sense-making loop? Could experiments with prompt engineering help this? I feel like this opens up a lot of open questions, but these are now things that we could potentially work on, and these are tangible things that we could do. So yeah, this is our contribution. Again, just to remind everyone in the room. Like I said, paper code available if my talk makes you think that you might want to play around with this. And this is how you can reach us. Thank you. Oh, great.
Hello, thanks for joining. I want to talk about a different use case using similar methods and maybe take a contrarian, a critical point of view near the end of my little talk. To start, we are a team of myself, Elizabeth Hodges and Meg Heckman, who are colleagues here in the School of Journalism. And I want to talk about content audits. So specifically, we run a professionally edited newspaper called The Scope online. And the motivation here is to practice journalism as a service, specifically connecting to social justice stories in the Boston area, right? So a hyper-local source trying to talk about and amplify stories otherwise not talked about. Editorial desire focused on accountability and reaching those populations. And that setting both has very strong, very clear goals of the type of reporting we want to do, and also is a small enough, tight enough place that we can try some experiments. So we decided to. So based on the larger context many of us know about news deserts, not just thinking about geographical ones, but also identity-based ones and demographic ones, and what role the university could play in trying to fill those, which is work that Meg has been pioneering so much of. We decided to do a content audit focused on diversity. In a bunch of different ways, but specifically on content diversity, what is in the paper, in the stories that we're writing, how can we measure what is being covered, who's being covered, against those goals that I shared earlier of the paper, right? So these have gotten very popular lately, some trying to do on the intake side, look at who's being interviewed and things like that, some retroactively being applied. So we're in that space. We specifically decided to look at places, topics, and quoted speakers as a set of 3 metrics that one of them turned into a second one, but basically that we could try to correlate between to try to identify things. So just to give you a sense of the data set, the corpus is about 700 stories, very easily exportable from our WordPress site, but could easily be fed in via a sitemap of URLs, things like that. Relatively constant production. This is mostly staffed by grad student writers. So there's some bumps around production, but relatively stable. We trimmed it down based on the content blend and a couple other heuristics. There's a little bit of seasonal publishing there that you see based on the university schedule. So that's our corpus. So we wanted to look at 3 things: topics, places, and quoted speakers. Topics we extracted using a topic detection tool built a couple years ago with transfer learning from the New York Times corpus. I have other stuff I can say about that, but it's an off-the-shelf Dockerized API. So anyone that's doing a content audit that knows how to do a Python notebook can use this tool. Very easy to send in text, get back JSON, off the shelf. Places, similar thing. We used an off-the-shelf tool for doing geographic extraction. This is also one that I worked on that's been used for years. Custom tuned for news a little bit to give you places mentioned, connects to geonames to give you latitude and longitude. Again, off-the-shelf, Dockerized service, very easy to run and use. The third one's much more complicated. So it turns out a quote extraction, speaker identification, it just kind of isn't a solved problem. There's a bunch of examples. There's a bunch of papers. Very few of those papers have code that you can get and run. The ones that do, if you try to run it, about 80% of the time the code doesn't work because it's not a maintained tool. So it's not something a newsroom could pull off a shelf and just deploy. The ones that are, just don't work well in the domain of news, as far as our testing showed. They might work well in other domains, but they just didn't work well in the domain of news. We created a hand-labeled corpus, we tested it, we were like, this is terrible, what can we do? So there's an opportunity and motivation to try a chat-based large language model interface, right? It says it can do a lot, let's try it and see. The problem statement for that third one is this problem statement. This is a piece of text from one of the articles. How do you take this quote, work backwards, and figure out that the speaker, do the co-reference resolution up to the speaker name, which was in a prior paragraph. How do you get the quote out, right? We have linguistic cues in English, and with an R writing of the scope, it's going to be double quotes. And then, can you do the anaphora resolution? Can you get the pronoun that was being used to reference it? And we cared about that because that's a ethically sound way for us to do gender, right? Going off of names is incredibly problematic. Tons of different literature shows that. But most papers have very strong, very clear rules about how they reference pronouns, right? So like this is something we can use in a way that we felt would work and also in concert with the editor of the paper, one that made sense to them. So that's what we did. There was a super long prompt on the left that gave us some JSON on the right. So the first phase is quote extraction. And the model kind of looks like this, right? So we start with stories. We use this spacey-based tools to pull out to place names. We use this topic labeler to get out story themes. These are things like sports or politics or things like that, using a taxonomy that we had built previously, built on the New York Times one. And then we had this more complicated ChatGPT-based thing to extract, disambiguate, and then we also labeled public figures or not, because it was a small enough corpus of quoted speakers that we could do that. So we found some great things against the metrics and the goals of the publication. First, people referenced by she were quoted more than people referenced by he, right? Which is not what the norm is in every other study. Why is that? We have some hypotheses around the fact that many of the journalists in the program themselves identify as women and use she, and there's other research that shows that women are more likely to quote or interview women. So we think that has something to do with it. This points back to like one of the gender-based goals of the scope itself, the publication. Right? This is in line with their goals. So by this metric, they felt pretty good. A second very high-level finding: public officials were not the majority of people quoted. Again, we've seen lots of other research that shows that that is not the case. Usually those official figures are the ones that are used most often. Another success at a high level vis-a-vis their mission statement. Great, thanks. More focus on, this is a topic-based, this is the geography. What you see on the left is a list of neighborhoods in the Boston area, and the length of the bar is the number of mentions across stories, so the number of stories that mentioned it. So you see some key neighborhoods in Boston, if you know the area, aren't covered as much as they could be. So this pointed to a chance to do more coverage, send more reporters into those areas, and a hypothesis around maybe those areas not being places students lived. So can we do some cultural competency training around making sure they feel comfortable going into those neighborhoods to build trust, to then report on issues there. Topic-wise, a lot of conversation with culture, economics, politics. So definitely the cultural reporting, when you look at the examples, it's very much an us narrative, not an othering narrative. So they felt good about that from their editorial guidelines. Politics and economics, again, they were like versions of that were relevant to the audiences when you do the qualitative evaluation. So you pair these, the quantitative with the qualitative here. You can do the intersection of these two. So topics on the left and places, parts of town in the middle and on the bottom. The darker the color, the higher the coverage. You see some obvious things. Beacon Hill, if you don't know Boston, is where the government is. So it's not surprising there's a lot of politics reporting. We see some nice validation. Nubian Square, which had a bunch of revitalization, has a lot of economics coverage and what's covered. So that was great. There's openings like environment in Dorchester isn't being covered much. So you can come up with things, and an editor can look at this and say, oh, great. I lost my quote. Oh no, I lost my quote size. Okay, well, here's the thing. I wrote 3 pages of concerns and limitations about this, and it sort of covered some of this stuff that we don't talk about and hasn't been mentioned yet today. And I've seen 5 different LLM talk. So I'm going to be contrarian here, right? Like, nobody's mentioned the economic footprint of these models. Nobody's mentioned comparing supervised models with something like BERT, which cost-wise, in terms of energy, is like a couple order of magnitudes, as far as I can tell, if not more, than ChatGPT. These are not really trusted parties. Like, who thinks that ChatGPT is a trustworthy partner? OpenAI is a trustworthy partner for a newspaper, right? Like, they're more like Facebook, which do any of us think that's a, sorry to Facebook, but like, demonstrably not a trustworthy partner, right? Like, evidentiary is not. And that's like, it's not, they're bad. I'm not saying they're bad people. There's a misalignment of goals. So I think there's validation challenges with generative AI models, which always, when people mean it, they usually mean chat-based interfaces to these generative LLMs. And then, like, is there training data actually, like, is there a connection there with local news coverage? I'm not really sure. It's the whole internet, right? So, like, I'm not really sure about that. So it kind of left me feeling this feeling of a guilty consumer, right? I used this and it felt like when I order from Amazon in the US. And I'm like, man, this is great. I'm not thinking about the economic footprint. I'm not thinking about the labor rights issues. I get to ignore them. And to make sure the better analogy, which is like bottled water, right? Sometimes you need it and it's great that it's there and you get the water. But like, that should happen very, very not often. You should bring the water with you. It should be available publicly. So like, that made me feel kind of bad. And like, that's what I want to poke at a little bit and nudge. Like, how do we ask ourselves questions about when we want to use this stuff? And when do we justify the answers? And like, there's a reason we didn't do geography and topic with ChatGPT. There's no reason to, right? It doesn't perform better in our measurements than a supervised model that's been used for years that like, I can give you really good examples of the training data, of how it works and where it fails, and other people's assessments, and I can run it on my laptop, and I don't need to integrate with some API that's going to change, so the maintenance cost is better. That matters to us because we were thinking about, like, how can we build an automated toolbox, right? How can we make a tool so these content audits are easier for anybody to run? You put in your sitemap, and it just runs and gives you a bunch of data that you get to decide what it tells you and doesn't tell you about your content. We think that university newsrooms like the Scope are a great testing lab for this, so we advocate for those types of partnerships. We think that like it's because they have those deep knowledge of their editorial guidelines. But part of this is saying that we want to follow the public health model, like make the healthy choice the easy choice, right? So how can we build tools where we're trying to bake in that idea that we're only using these generative AI models when we have to? Because the integration cost is higher, the maintenance cost is higher, and like all of that stuff about my concerns, like you gotta acknowledge it and like sit with it for a while in your work. So I would push folks that are doing this work just to figure out what your answers are and what your motivations are, because they're there, they should be reasonable and good, but we should think about it harder. And like, you know, in the middle of the day shouldn't be the first session I've been to where like somebody's like feeling a little bit like, this is weird. So thank you for listening.
Testing, hello. Hi, my name is Will Brannon. Thank you all for coming. I'm here to talk to you about a study from our group at the MIT Media Lab about the speed and sentiment of news in different media. We look particularly at Twitter and talk radio as examples of social and broadcast media, and I'll have a bit more to say about that choice in a second. But first, let's talk about why, what the motivation is, what the problem is. As this group probably doesn't need to be told, the media is changing rapidly. Both the news cycle is both speeding up and getting more negative, and both of these trends have a long history. They go back at least as far as like the development of cable news and talk radio in the 1980s. But many commentators, both popular and academic, think that this has sped up with the internet, that there's a lot of like contribution of online media, social media to these trends. What interests me and what interested us in this problem is why these are happening. Is it concomitant social and business changes, or is it effects of the media themselves that stem from their particular affordances and characteristics? So To drill down on that question, we picked a particular pair of media. Twitter, which has recently been renamed X, but I'm going to use the old name, and talk radio. And these are respectively influential examples of social and traditional broadcast media. Twitter, during our study period, and still to some degree today, has a very elite and influential user base. So a lot of journalists, politicians, public figures, as well as a mass audience. And radio is sort of the opposite. Elites do listen to radio, but it has a very wide reach. It reaches a large majority of Americans, according to Nielsen data, as high as 90-ish%, though talk formats are a little smaller than that. And so we get to provide good examples of both the media before and after this internet and social media revolution. Now, of course, you might wonder why this matters. Like, what are we interested in learning here? Why pay attention to this? My interest in it stems from the impact of these news cycle changes on democracy and public debate. So if the news cycle is speeding up and becoming more outraged, you might be concerned that makes it harder for society to sustain attention to issues and harder for parties and other groups to collaborate across their various divides. There's also a connection to the intermedia agenda-setting literature in political science, where a medium which discusses news more quickly may be able to see its particular biases and proclivities become more influential. So this may be one mechanism of intermedia influence. We've turned this into a couple of concrete research questions. So first, do Twitter events both rise and fall faster than radio events? Does discussion increase and then fall off more quickly on Twitter? Prior work and just the experience of using Twitter, I think, should lead you to expect that the rise will be faster, but we can break more ground on the falling end. What does the decay of attention to news look like online versus on broadcast media? And then second, we want to know whether there are systematic differences in affect or emotional content between these media. I think the answer here, the answer you should expect here is genuinely pretty unclear. So there has been some work on outrage online and on social media, and it's clearly a prominent part of these media. But the medium of Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity might be able to hold its own on outrage, so we weren't sure what to expect going into this. So to address those questions, we focused on 3 different data sources. One is a set of the tweets of an elite group of national journalists and politicians and other influential public figures. Covers the major national news outlets, members of Congress, other prominent people in the discourse. The second is a random sample of Twitter's fire hose of all tweets. So we want to see what the mass audience, as well as the elite audience on Twitter, is talking about. And then the third one is a corpus of radio transcripts. We collected it from about 200 stations around the United States, built transcripts from the raw audio, did some deduplication and cleaning. And all of these data sets cover the same 3 periods in 2019, 2020, and 2021. So we get a nice selection of news events during this time, March and April of 2020 particularly, but there are also important things happening before and after that. So to find and analyze events in these media, I won't go into too much detail about the methodology, but we used an algorithm called NewsLens to find events. This has been developed over several papers over the years. It finds a particular kind of event, which consists of a group of tweets or a group of radio speaker turns. So then an event is the discussion of the event. Defining events in that way. We did a bunch of hand validation, and the events look reasonable, they make sense, they are topically coherent. And then to analyze the affect, we treated that as a natural language inference task and used a language model to assign probabilities of these 3 labels: negative, emotional, and outraged. This produces probabilities, which we can interpret as scores for how likely the event is to be any of these 3 emotional, negative, or outraged states. It's also nice that you don't need huge language models to do this. We used BART and BERT-sized models. Hardware costs are reasonable. So, 3 results. Let's move right along. First, on the event speed question. These plots show what I call within event relative times. So to explain that, if an event consists of a group of tweets, the first tweet chronologically has relative time 0. A tweet that occurs 3 minutes later has relative time 3 minutes. One that occurs 5 minutes after that is 8 minutes. So rather than the absolute time that the tweet occurred. So the results, both from this empirical density and histogram, are that Twitter is, generally speaking, systematically faster than radio, both to rise and to fall. Elite Twitter is fastest. Journalists are pretty quick on the ball. They talk about news events speedily. Firehose Twitter is somewhat slower, but generally faster than radio, with the interesting exception of 2020 COVID discussion. So people in the Firehose were discussing this in a slower, sort of way that's more connected to their daily experience. I think this is a nice example of both medium-specific effects, but also of media affordances not determining everything. Real-world events can still make themselves felt and change discussion. We also looked at the affective biases, and here there's a very clear story. Radio is the least outraged of these 3 corpora by quite a lot, also the least negative, the least emotional. General Twitter mass audience users are very mad about a lot of things, and journalists on Twitter are somewhere in between. So I can't say this for sure, but this work suggests an interesting possibility that future work should pick up of whether the audience's negativity is influencing journalists in that direction. So journalists on Twitter are more negative than journalists on radio. Why might that be? People should look into it. And then finally, we looked at one more piece of interesting analysis about the time course of these affect variables during a story's life cycle. The first thing to see on these plots is that a small number of stories in all 3 corpora are especially negative and outraged. So as the number of active stories declines, the story that's active stories that are active become more negative and more outraged. But over on the left side of the plots, where more stories are active, you can see that the life cycle differs between the 2 Twitter corpora and radio. Can you see my mouse? Yeah. So the radio stories don't tend to have changes in how negative or outraged they are over their life cycles, but the Twitter ones do. We did some regression analysis that I don't have a snappy visualization of that finds that this is mostly about the lifetimes of different kinds of stories rather than within story time trends. So models with and without event fixed effects find that what's going on Twitter is much more of a pop of outraged stories arising, rapidly falling off, being replaced, whereas radio is less like that and selects for different kinds of events. All right, so to wrap up, leave time for questions. What have we learned here? First thing is that the news cycle differs substantially between media. Twitter is systematically faster to start discussing events and also to stop discussing events. There are, of course, exceptions. Sometimes radio stories are quicker, but this is a general trend. Twitter is also more negative and more outraged, with some pretty clear differences in how these affect variables are distributed over time. As far as we can tell, this is the first large-scale data-driven comparison of outrage between Twitter and traditional media. There's been some work that's focused on blogs and other online media, but not Twitter yet. And so all in all, this seems to say that Twitter is shrinking the media's collective attention span, and because of the rise of similar sites like Threads, Blue Sky, and so on, you might think that this is both an account of the past during 2019 to 2021, but also a preview of what may be coming for journalism in the future as more news migrates to and is influenced by these sorts of sites. Finally, I'll just call out one interesting future work direction, I think, which is to ask why this is happening. What features of Twitter make it like this? what conclusions can we draw about platform design, how can social sites try to avoid some of these proclivities and biases, and that's it. If you are interested, please get in touch, check out the paper. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for all the presentations. So I have a question for William for your study, because you mentioned you have the 2019, 2020, 2021 data. So when you are doing the study, did you find over the time the audience, either radio or like Twitter, is getting more outrage or negative comparing to the other years, or is there a relationship like that?
Good question. Yeah, so we didn't find any really strong trend over time. I think we found similar results across all 3 time periods, with the exception of 2020 COVID. But it's possible that there's a smaller or subtle trend. We didn't look too closely at that.
So thanks. My question also goes to William. Did you consider geographical context in your study? Because where I come from, I'm from Ghana, West Africa. It's more obvious that outrage is very common on radio, because we have local news stations where everything is discussed in our local languages, and people get to understand more and get more emotional about them. Did you consider that?
So we looked. I guess I should first start by clarifying that all of our data is about the United States. So the journalists are U.S. national journalists. The radio stations are from the U.S. And the Firehose data is in English. We didn't look at the geographic dimension, really. We tried to find radio stations that were representative of the whole U.S. ecosystem, but did not look too much at the geographic dimension of it, especially because Twitter doesn't really have good geolocation data, so it's hard to do a good comparison of geography to geography across media. But that would be interesting, and yeah, would be a promising future research direction.
Hi, great presentations all around. This was really insightful and informative. Question about the jargon detection of GPT, or the direction I was thinking, and this is more of an what's your opinion kind of question rather than a technical question. But there are sites like Alpha Archive and human generated jargon reduction processes and websites and all of that. So I'm wondering how you think about where do you see these things going? Is there a possible combination of creating a browser extension where you sort of limit jargon or expand on it? You mentioned scroll over a word and you expanded that. There's a photo about that in the thing. And I'm just wondering where do you see this going, and how do you see this helping the scientific community?
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought up Alpha Archive. I think it's a really nice system. It, for those unfamiliar, it kind of overlays on top of the archive preprint server. And I think you can have comments with the authors as well, right? My personal opinion is that I think a lot of the future of all of these reading interfaces is you have some kind of crowdsourcing involved, some human intervention, and somewhere where automation also plays a role in kind of making information more accessible. So the past study I talked about, we actually used crowdsourced ratings of newsworthiness. So I think that's also an important mechanism. I think the answer is somewhere in the hybrid of these mechanisms, and I think it remains to be seen how pragmatic concerns, like Rahul said about the ecological impact, also the feasibility, what a newsroom has resources for, and what you can measure, just measure in terms of where humans can play a role. Triaging across those things.
Question for Rahul. You mentioned making the healthy choice, the easy choice, that is making Gen AI the tool of last resort. How do you envision doing so, in building and training such that diversity reporting becomes the norm?
It's a good question. We were focused not on the motivation question, but on the instrumentation question, right? So if we can make a push button version of an auditing tool that can be extended and build it in collaboration with newsrooms, then I think we can make decisions in the platform design that minimize the use of things like generative AI, so that the thing that's like, oh, there's this website that does it for me. That's great. Everybody wants to use a website that does things for you for first tier, right? And then if you want to do something deeper, great. But as a first tier, if we can make something that really is push button, where you put in your URL, you hit go with maybe some checkboxes about what you're looking for or what your interests are, and then it gives you something basic that I think is significantly different than let's spin up 2 folks and hire them that can pull our whole archive of stories and feed it into this API and generate some graphs. That's expensive and it takes time. So that's what we were thinking about, to try to make it something that more organizations can do, right? In the spirit of holding newsrooms to account, newsrooms that want to hold themselves to account, to a community, to the mission statement. How can we help them do that more easily? That's kind of how I was thinking about it.
I'll also ask a follow-up questions regarding your list of concerns. So I agree there's not enough emphasis being placed on them, and I think it's interesting because we are in this norm-setting time where we should be figuring this out. To me, it feels like some of the things you raise feel more addressable than other things, right? So you could think of smaller language models to limit the environmental impact, or things like using open source or local models to help with the data sharing. I'm curious, I guess, which types of concerns, or which of your concerns you view as intrinsic to using language model, we cannot get away from this, versus the ones where it's we need better understanding of how to develop healthy research practices with these new tools we now have access to.
Yes. I say that to say you've diagnosed and sort of I think addressed a categorization really helpfully, right? So I think for me, I am excited about the idea of creating some of those as that list of concerns becomes a list of motivations, right? But something we have a lot of work on already, right? Debiasing, vectors, right? We have a lot of work on that. So don't tell me it's oh, we can't debias these models. No, there's a bunch of work on biases. I think there's been a lot of people talking about, oh, let's train a different LLM, right? A generative LLM on just news content, right? If we get just news and then train an LLM on just news, it'll all be factual, whatever it generates, and it won't have bias. What are you talking about? News has bias. We have decades of study of that. So I think some of them are starting from computational assumptions rather than social assumptions. And I think that's the main thing I would push on, right? Is we all enjoy thinking about technologies as computational systems, but they're technosocial systems. So own the social part and have an answer when someone asks you a social question. And if I disagree with the answer, that's fine, we can talk about it. If you haven't asked the question and don't have an answer, then this is stuff people have been saying for decades. There's so many books about this, and it's just annoying to me personally that we're in this phase again. And it's, sometimes you want to throw your hands up and be really? Right? Really we're doing this again? There's just been a lot of work, and it feels okay, for as a researcher and someone that works with newsrooms, how can we do better this time? I'm interested in that. So to me, because so much of my work is applied, I want to make examples that I argue do better on this set of metrics that are technosocial, and then maybe that can spur conversation. So that doesn't answer, but it's related thoughts. I appreciate your framing of it.
I think that my question is for everyone, really, all the speakers, because don't get me wrong, I love automation and I love what ChatGPT and other tools can do. But I'm just wondering if we are not starting to focus a lot on what these automation tools can do, and we forget about training journalists to do stuff. So aren't we becoming lazy in a way, right? Like that journalists are sometimes thinking, oh, I don't need to know what this program is doing because it's doing it for me. It spits out numbers and they look persuasive. The same about jargon, right? Like, aren't we forgetting to teach researchers to maybe forget the jargon for a moment? I'm just wondering what you're thinking about this balance.
Who first?
This is something I really struggle with my own work. I feel like sometimes some of these automation solutions that we propose are like putting a band-aid on a bullet hole. There are many infrastructural problems. I mean, I think about this, why are we having to reckon, I've been tracking how many archive preprints are put up every month, thousands going up. Peer reviews, something is going on there, right? And why are journalists so pressed for time? Why do we need tools to enhance their efficiency? Just to add to the list of problems you're talking about. Which is to say, I don't have a good answer, but I think you're right in that there is something more social and something more like infrastructural going on there that I think we need to diagnose and think about. I'm with you, but I really don't have a good answer. I'm using my work to think through these problems as well.
Just add one thing there. So there's been work on that question specifically in like civic technology spaces, right? Like which points of friction are actually useful and you don't want to automate. And I think we can learn a lot from those, right? So asking the question of what is lost when something is automated is just as important of the work of automating it. And in our department, we were talking about in our last faculty meeting about what happens when you're not transcribing audio, right? When you're not sitting there listening and typing it, what is lost when something generates it for you? And it's something real, right? And it's a trade-off. Like you can also get like 5 transcriptions done in a day. So it's not an answer, but to say that like there is related work on ways of thinking about points of friction and how you decide whether it's meaningful or not, that could probably be learned from.
I just want to add something about like the co-evolution of technology and human, because I feel like we're at a very weird and interesting stage where like every day there's this new technology and like push like every human being to think about, okay, what will be my future job like when AI is able to do a lot of cool stuff. To me, something I've been thinking about recently is about this real technique. Is about like what to do, about like the intention, about like what human need, versus like how to do it. Is like the specific techniques and skills to do it. I feel like as AI is getting better and better, it becomes less important. Like a lot of skills will be like unnecessary. For example, like a lot of years ago, we still need to know how to make fire, right? Many years ago. But now we don't need to do that. But what's more important is to understand what the people need, to understand, okay, what kind of technology we want to create, what kind of product we want to create. I feel that's also the same and the most important responsibility of journalists is to understand what people need, what kind of information people want. That's something that cannot always be replaced by AI. And also, like speaking of like training and like for each generation, like the university and schools are teaching very different things. And now everyone's using computer, but like 30 years ago, like all the journalism and stuff were done on paperwork. I feel like the training also need to co-evolve with like the new practices, and we actually need to do this faster and faster because technology changing also in a very like rapid style. But also now with all of this too, we can also like produce better training faster. A lot of like recent work has been like how you can use AI to train better psychologists, therapists, and maybe journalists. And but I do see there's like this huge space like that, how we can use technology, how we can better serve different needs, especially for journalism.
Okay, well, we're eating into your lunch. I don't think there's any rule that we have to stop, though, but feel free to leave. Did you have a question? Is there one more question?
Last question.
Okay.
Thanks. I guess it would be for first presenter, Jiaxin. And in your presentation, I think you said the limitations section of the papers was like most congruous with how they're reported. So it kind of paints a picture of like kind of a headline grabbing abstract, and then just follow it up with a caveat in detail. But like now that this platform's like Reddit, and I think there's groups like I think Love Science and stuff, like do you feel like there's any trend in the authors of the academic papers themselves sort of sensationalizing their research and making it digestible for journalists?
Yeah, I do think that's a valid concern, and it's definitely happening. Just look at how many like LLM papers are, like the authors themselves are, making a lot of big claims about AI, about LLM in the title, in the abstract, but what they're actually doing is not right. I think a lot of people claiming like we're too bad at AI, guy, but I think it's definitely it's like a common concern, and it's really tough to tell how to do about it, because it's like, the mechanism like for journalism and for this news is like, we like the editors need to make sure that like the articles get read, and so they want to create like hyped or maybe like clickbait headlines. That's also very similar for academia. It's like there are like so many papers every day, and researchers also want their paper to get read, and so they will create like titles that get people to read. I feel like it's something. It's always like a trade-off that where how you make a good enough claim and whether your claim is backed up by the evidence. There's this obvious trade-off, but I mean, academia is not just perfect. There are so many issues, and I feel that's also a very big issue that like all the researchers should think about how we should address this.
All right, let's thank our speakers.